My sister asked me to watch her 7-year-old grandson for what she called a business trip, and on his second morning with me, he asked me a question over a bowl of oatmeal that I have not been able to forget since. He was stirring the same spoonful in slow circles, not eating, just stirring, and without looking up he asked me, "Uncle Roy, if I get sick here, will you still keep me, or will you send me back?" Before I tell you what happened after that question, let me know what state you're watching from tonight in the comments. And if you believe every child deserves to feel wanted in their own family, hit that like button right now. My name is Roy. I'm 61 years old. I spent 38 years as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, the last 15 of those running the fraud investigation unit. People think insurance is boring paperwork, and most of it is. But the fraud side taught me something that never leaves you once you learn it. People lie in patterns. Nobody lies randomly. A liar always leaves the same kind of fingerprint over and over, because the story they're protecting never actually changes underneath the surface details. I thought I'd left all that behind when I retired 2 years ago. I figured my biggest challenge from here on out would be keeping the gutters clean and beating my neighbor Frank at chess on Sunday afternoons. The universe, as it turns out, had other plans for my retirement. It started on a Tuesday evening when my sister Carol called me, her voice doing that particular kind of bright and breezy that I'd learned decades ago to be suspicious of. Carol is 58, 2 years younger than me, and she married into money the way some people win the lottery suddenly and without much preparation for what comes after. Her husband died 8 years ago and left her a house in a gated community called Pine Hollow Estates, and a lifestyle she has been aggressively maintaining ever since, mostly on the back of appearances rather than actual funds, as far as I could tell from a distance. Carol asked me if I could take her grandson Mason for what she described as just a little business trip situation with her current boyfriend Gary. She said it would only be 6 days. She said Mason had been acting difficult lately and she needed a break to handle some financial matters before they left for a Caribbean cruise she'd already mentioned twice on Facebook. I said yes before she even finished the sentence, because that's what you do for family, or at least that's what I always believed you do for family. Carol pulled into my driveway the next afternoon in a car I didn't recognize, a white luxury SUV that still had the dealer's paper plate taped in the back window. She was wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and she barely glanced at me as she circled around to the passenger door. Mason got out on his own. Nobody helped him. He is 7 years old, small for his age, with a mop of brown hair that clearly hadn't been cut in a while, wearing a hoodie with a stain on the sleeve, and sneakers that were at least one size too small, his little toes practically pressing against the canvas at the front. Carol handed me a plastic grocery bag instead of a suitcase. She said his things were mostly in there and that she grabbed the rest when she picked him up. She didn't crouch down to hug him. She didn't even really look at him. She said, "Be good for Uncle Roy. Don't be a pain," tossed it over her shoulder like she was talking to a coworker she barely tolerated, and got back in the SUV. Gary, who I'd never actually met in person before that moment, gave me a two-finger wave from the driver's seat and pulled away before I could even ask what airport they were flying out of. I looked down at Mason. He was standing very still on my driveway, staring at his shoes, his hands jammed deep into the pocket of his hoodie. I asked him if he was hungry. He said no, very quietly, the kind of no that a kid gives you when the real answer is complicated. I took him inside, showed him the guest room, which used to be my daughter's room before she moved to Ohio for work, and tried to make some easy conversation about baseball, dinosaurs, video games, anything a 7-year-old boy might care about. He answered everything with single words. Yes. No. Okay. He moved through my house like he was trying to take up as little space as physically possible, like he'd trained himself somewhere along the way to be invisible. The next morning is when everything started to unravel. I got up early, made a big American breakfast, scrambled eggs, sausage links, a stack of pancakes with butter melting down the sides, the whole production. I wanted to see this kid smile. When Mason came into the kitchen, he didn't run to the table the way most kids do when they smell breakfast cooking. He walked slowly, sat down, and stared at the plate like it was something dangerous. I sat down across from him and asked if everything was okay, if maybe he didn't like pancakes, if he wanted something else instead. That's when he picked up his spoon, dipped it into a small bowl of plain oatmeal. I hadn't even noticed he'd quietly gotten for himself instead, and started stirring it in slow, careful circles without eating any of it. And that's when he asked me the question that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since. "Uncle Roy, if I get sick here, will you still keep me, or will you send me back? I felt something crack open in my chest, right below my ribs. A feeling I hadn't experienced since my wife passed 6 years ago. I asked him, as gently as I possibly could, why he would ever think I'd send him back for getting sick. He set the spoon down very carefully, like it might make a noise that would get him in trouble, and told me that at Grandma Carol's house, when he gets sick, Gary calls him a drain and says sick kids cost money, nobody has, and that last time he had a fever, they made him sleep in the laundry room for 3 nights so he wouldn't, in his exact words, get his germs on the good furniture. I sat there gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white, doing everything in my power to keep my face calm while something inside me was screaming. 38 years of insurance fraud investigation had trained me to spot when a story didn't hold together, and every single piece of this one was screaming at me. The brand new SUV, the designer sunglasses, the Caribbean cruise, and a 7-year-old boy in shoes that didn't fit, terrified of getting sick in someone else's house. I reached across the table and put my hand over his small one. I told him, and I meant every single word of it, that in this house, nobody ever gets punished for being sick, that food was never something he had to earn, and that there was absolutely nothing on this earth that would ever make me send him away. He looked at me like I was speaking some language he'd never encountered before, like the concept itself didn't compute. Then, slowly, cautiously, he picked up his fork instead of the spoon, cut off a piece of pancake, and ate it. Watching him eat that first bite broke something loose in me, and underneath the heartbreak, something colder and more determined started forming, a resolve I hadn't felt since my last major fraud case before retirement. Later that same morning, Mason mentioned, almost as an afterthought while coloring at my kitchen table, that he needed his allergy medicine, because springtime always made his eyes swell up and his throat get tight. I checked the grocery bag Carol had left. 3 t-shirts, 1 pair of shorts, a single sock with no match. No medicine of any kind. A boy with a documented allergy issue sent away for 6 days with nothing to manage it. That's not an oversight. In my old line of work, we called that a pattern indicator. A small piece of evidence that on its own means nothing, but stacked next to everything else, starts painting a very specific and very ugly picture. I told Mason I needed to run an errand and that my neighbor, Frank's wife Diane, a retired school nurse who lived 2 doors down, would come sit with him for a bit and watch some cartoons together. I made sure he was settled, comfortable, safe, and only then did I get in my car and drive the 20 minutes across town to Pine Hollow Estates. Carol had given me a spare key years ago, back when she used to travel more and needed someone to water her plants and check on the house. I told myself I was only going in to find Mason's medicine. The house was cold and silent when I let myself in, the kind of silence that has a texture to it, heavy and staged. Everything was immaculate, the kind of immaculate that comes from a cleaning service rather than from anyone actually living comfortably in the space. There were framed photos in the hallway, dozens of them. Carol and Gary on a beach somewhere. Carol and Gary at what looked like a wine tasting. Carol and Gary on a boat. I walked the entire length of that hallway and did not find a single photograph of Mason. Not one. It was as if the house had been curated to erase any evidence that a child lived there at all. I found his room eventually, tucked behind the laundry room exactly like he'd described. A converted storage space barely big enough for the twin mattress shoved into the corner. No posters, no toys, no rug on the cold tile floor. A small stack of folded clothes sat on top of a plastic bin because there wasn't even a dresser. On a shelf above the mattress, I found an old shoebox. Inside were report cards from his school, every single one showing excellent grades and glowing teacher comments about a bright, well-behaved boy, alongside a folder of receipts for Carol's plastic surgery consultations and a torn corner of what looked like an envelope from an attorney's office. My stomach turned over. I photographed everything I could find without touching more than I had to. Then I checked one more room. The primary bedroom was the size of my entire downstairs. A walk-in closet stuffed with clothing tags still attached, a jewelry box overflowing onto the dresser. The contrast between that room and the space Mason slept in wasn't neglect. It was a decision, made deliberately, over and over. Underneath a stack of magazines on Carol's nightstand, I found a folder, the kind you'd get from a lawyer's office, with a return address I recognized immediately because I dealt with firms like it my whole career, the kind of firm that specializes in exactly one thing: guardianship and estate law. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a summary letter regarding something called the Whitfield Family Trust, established by Mason's late father, my nephew Danny, who had passed away in a car accident 4 years earlier. The trust, it turned out, held nearly $340,000 in restricted funds designated for Mason's care and education to be released to whoever held legal guardianship of him in structured monthly disbursements of $6,200 until his 18th birthday. Attached to that letter was a second document, far more recent, dated only 3 weeks earlier. It was a formal notice of intent to petition the county family court for what the paperwork called voluntary relinquishment of guardianship due to documented behavioral and medical management difficulties exceeding caregiver capacity. In plain English, which is exactly what I asked the lawyer I would call later that same day to translate for me, Carol and Gary were preparing to formally hand Mason over to the state to have him placed in foster care or an institutional setting, while simultaneously filing to remain the trust's designated financial custodians on the grounds that Mason's ongoing special needs required them to continue managing and dispersing his funds even after he was no longer living under their roof. They were engineering a situation where they could get rid of the child entirely while keeping every single dollar that belonged to him. The trip to the Caribbean wasn't a vacation. Looking at the itinerary tucked into the same folder, dated to begin the exact day the court petition would be officially filed, it was a celebration, timed perfectly, so they'd be sipping drinks on a cruise ship while the paperwork that would erase their responsibility to a 7-year-old boy quietly worked its way through the county system. I sat down right there on the edge of that enormous bed, surrounded by clothes that still had the price tags on, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very cold, the way it always used to right before I built a case that I knew, with absolute certainty, I was going to win. I put everything back exactly the way I'd found it. I found Mason's allergy medicine in the bathroom cabinet, grabbed it, and drove back to my house with my jaw clenched the entire way, rehearsing over and over in my mind how I was going to explain any of this to a 7-year-old boy who already believed getting sick meant getting sent away. That evening, once Mason was asleep, I called my old college roommate, Harold Chen, who'd spent his entire legal career in family and estate law downtown. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said the words that confirmed every fear I'd had crawling up my spine all day. "Roy, this isn't just neglect anymore. This is premeditated financial exploitation of a minor. And if what you're describing is accurate, they are trying to use the state as a laundering mechanism for a trust they have no legal right to keep controlling." Harold told me the petition hearing was already scheduled, 11 days out, and that if it went through uncontested, Carol and Gary could keep drawing that $6,200 a month indefinitely, all while Mason became a ward of an overburdened state system with nobody advocating for him at all. I asked Harold what I needed to do. He told me that timing was everything, that I needed to file for emergency guardianship myself before that court date, and that I needed documentation, testimony, and ideally law enforcement involvement before Carol and Gary ever suspected I knew anything. He told me the sicker feeling part of it. Financial exploitation of a trust and abandonment for profit wasn't just a family court matter anymore. It was criminal. The next several days moved like a slow-building storm. I spent the mornings with Mason, teaching him how to fish off the dock at the little lake near my house, watching him slowly, carefully start to unclench, start to laugh at my terrible jokes, start to eat full meals without checking my face first for permission. I spent the afternoons and evenings on the phone with Harold, with a detective from the county's Financial Crimes Division named Patricia Alvarez, and with a caseworker from Child Protective Services who, once she reviewed the photographs and the documents I'd found, told me flatly that what I described was one of the more calculated cases of financial child abandonment she'd encountered in her 14 years on the job. We built the case methodically, the way I'd built hundreds of fraud cases before. Detective Alvarez pulled banking records under a warrant and confirmed that Carol and Gary had already taken out a home equity line of credit against the Pine Hollow house, using projected future trust disbursements as collateral in a private loan arrangement, essentially betting the house on money that legally belonged to a child. Harold filed my emergency guardianship petition quietly, timed to be heard the same day as theirs, a full week before Carol and Gary were scheduled to return from their cruise. Mason started sleeping through the night without nightmares somewhere around day 4. He started asking questions about dinosaurs and wanting to know if we could get a dog. On day 5, he asked me, completely unprompted while we were washing dishes together, if I thought his dad would be proud of him. I told him his father would be prouder of him than of anything else in this world, and I meant it with everything I had in me. Carol called on day 6, right on schedule, her voice bright and sun-warm from the cruise, asking if Mason had been manageable, and letting me know she and Gary would swing by the following afternoon to collect him before heading home. I kept my voice as calm and unremarkable as I possibly could. I told her he'd been a wonderful house guest, no trouble at all, and that I'd see her tomorrow. Inside, every part of the fraud investigator I used to be was lining up the final pieces of a case I intended to close permanently. The next afternoon, Carol's white SUV pulled into my driveway right on time. I had Mason inside with Diane, watching a movie, while I stood on my front porch waiting. Carol got out, looking tan and refreshed, already reaching for her sunglasses to push them up onto her head, already talking about how exhausting the flight had been. Gary trailed behind her, checking his phone. Detective Alvarez and her partner were parked just down the street, out of sight, waiting for my signal. I told Carol we needed to talk before Mason came out, and something in my tone must have finally registered, because for the first time since she dropped that boy off on my driveway a week earlier, she actually looked directly at me with something other than distraction in her eyes. I told her I knew about the trust. I told her I knew about the guardianship petition, the loan against the house, the storage room she called a bedroom. I watched her face go through several rapid transformations, confusion, then calculation, then a scramble toward outrage, the exact sequence I'd watched 100 fraudulent claimants perform across a conference table over the decades. She started to say I had no right to go through her things, and that's when Detective Alvarez and her partner walked up the driveway. I won't pretend there was anything satisfying about watching my own sister get read her rights on my front lawn. There wasn't triumph in it, not really. There was mostly a deep, bone-tired grief for the person she used to be before grief and greed had apparently hollowed something out of her. Gary tried to bolt for the SUV and didn't make it past the mailbox. The neighbors came out onto their porches to watch, the way neighbors do, and I stood there and let it happen because it needed to happen, because an 11-year-old's worth of consequences had finally arrived exactly 11 days too late for comfort and exactly in time to matter. The following months moved with the kind of grinding, bureaucratic slowness that anyone who's ever dealt with family court will recognize immediately. But move they did. My emergency guardianship was granted within 2 weeks, made permanent 4 months later once the criminal case against Carol and Gary was fully underway. Gary pled guilty to fraud and financial exploitation of a minor and received 7 years, with the plea deal contingent on him cooperating fully in the case against Carol, which he did without much hesitation once he understood how the sentencing math worked in his favor. Carol fought it longer, hired a defense attorney with money that turned out to belong, once again, to Mason's trust, and ultimately accepted a plea for 4 years, with restitution ordered for every dollar improperly drawn from that account. Harold and I worked with the trust's original attorney to restructure everything under an independent court-appointed trustee, so that not one more dollar could ever be touched by anyone except for Mason's actual, documented needs, verified and approved by the court going forward. The Pine Hollow house was sold to help cover restitution. The white SUV, still not fully paid off, went back to the dealership. Mason has lived with me full-time for almost a year now. We turned my daughter's old bedroom into his room properly, painted it a deep ocean blue because he told me once that he wanted his walls to look like the bottom of the sea. There's a dresser now, and a bookshelf, and a poster of a stegosaurus that he insisted on hanging himself, slightly crooked, and I have never once suggested we straighten it. He goes to the school 2 blocks from my house. He made a friend named Tobias who comes over on Saturdays. We got a dog, a scruffy little terrier mix from the shelter that Mason named Fossil. And watching that boy fall asleep on the couch with a dog curled against his side, utterly unafraid, utterly unguarded, is a sight I don't think I will ever stop being grateful for. It was a Sunday morning a few weeks ago when I made that same breakfast again. Eggs, sausage, a stack of pancakes, the whole production. Mostly out of habit at this point rather than any deliberate plan. Mason came down in his pajamas, climbed into his chair, and looked at the plate in front of him. I felt my chest tighten for just a second. An old, worn reflex I don't think will ever fully go away. But there was no fear in his face this time. He just picked up his fork, looked up at me, and asked if we could add blueberries to the pancakes next time because Tobias said his mom does that and it's really good. I told him absolutely, and I sat down across from him with my coffee and watched him eat every single bite without once looking up to check if it was allowed. I spent 38 years learning how to spot the difference between a true story and a carefully constructed lie. I never once imagined that skill would end up saving my own great-nephew from being erased for the sake of a bank account. But sitting in my kitchen most mornings now, listening to Mason argue with the dog about who gets the last bite of toast, I understand something I never fully grasped during all those years of chasing fraudulent claims across a desk. Real wealth was never in the accounts, the settlements, or the trust funds I spent my career protecting from thieves. Real wealth is a 7-year-old boy who finally believes, without hesitation, that he is allowed to eat breakfast, allowed to get sick, and allowed to stay. If you believe every child deserves a home where they never have to ask if they're allowed to stay, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments what family really means to you.